Let's get into this first story here about Joy Reid, Chris Hayes, and Piers Morgan, because now it seems to be okay for pundits in mainstream media to actually start to criticize the state of Israel. And again, they were very timid about this, like in the beginning. After October 7th, they were speaking out, obviously, in favor of the state of Israel. They were criticizing the Palestinians and Hamas. There was no separation for a long time of the Palestinian people and Hamas. I noticed that across different media platforms and mainstream media. But then something changed. More video footage started to be released from Gaza, mainly from a lot of investigative journalists like Solomon, who was on earlier, and also more independent media. And eventually it just got to the point where you could not ignore the casualties that were happening, and you had to start asking some questions. So now we are starting to see mainstream media pundits, including ones like Piers Morgan, of all people, starting to now take a step back and critique the state of Israel. And some of that has to do with the lies that have been exposed on mainstream media, like this one from the Foreign Affairs Minister. Oh, this was a doozy. The interviewer in this clip said one of our colleagues said her family members were targeted in a church compound in Gaza. So listen to this take here. So here's the Foreign Affairs Minister. Listen to this.
Well, we're now joined from Tel Aviv by Yuli Edelstein. He's the chairman of the Israeli Parliament Foreign Affairs and Security Committee. Thank you very much for coming on the program. You heard our member of parliament, Leila Moran there, her relatives, 6 of them, targeted by Israeli army snipers in a church compound in Gaza. What on earth is going on?
Well, that's the question to Leila, not to me. I think that I can only say that we as the Jewish people are used to blood libels. So to hear that Israeli snipers are targeting women on purpose and not letting them leave the church is something that reminds me usually the atmosphere in the Middle Ages before another holiday.
Are you saying it's a lie? Are you saying it didn't happen?
This is a flat lie, absolutely. No Israeli sniper ever purposely targeted any civilian, to say nothing about women.
Well, we're now joined from Tel Aviv by Yuli Edelstein. He's the chairman of the Israeli Parliament.
Listen to this questioning again.
And Foreign Affairs and Security Committee. Thank you very much for coming on the program. You heard our member of parliament, Leila Moran there, her relatives, 6 of them, targeted by Israeli army snipers in a church compound in Gaza. What on earth is going on?
Well, that's the question to Leila, not to me. I think that I can only say that we as the Jewish people are used to blood libels. So to hear that Israeli snipers are targeting women on purpose and not letting them leave the church is something that reminds me usually the atmosphere in the Middle Ages before another holiday.
Are you saying it's a lie? Are you saying it didn't happen?
This is a flat lie, absolutely.
So first of all, a number of mainstream media outlets have already reported it and confirmed it. So this is a thing that we've noticed. Again, we've watched the state of Israel just blatantly lie, even when there are times where there's video footage. We watch Mehdi Hassan actually sit up there and debunk Netanyahu's advisor, where he tried to lie and say, well, I don't know what was written on the paper on the wall, when it was clearly that that was a calendar that the IDF was pointing to in the hospital. And they don't like it when you catch them in lies on air. Even Christine Amanpour actually had to finally acknowledge what is happening to people in the West Bank. So they covered this on CNN as well. It says in her latest report, Namel Begir documents how the West Bank settlers are escalating attacks on Palestinians. Listen to this. This was on CNN.
We stop at a service station in the occupied Palestinian West Bank. A man in military fatigues demands to check our IDs.
I have the right to secure this area, and I need to check who you are and what you're doing here.
He has no identifying insignia, won't tell us who he is, but he's got a gun. So we oblige. We're confused. And we're not the only ones.
You guys see this? This is the Palestinian people. They're basically under military occupation. This guy said, shut your mouth, I'll start shooting. Imagine if, and we have police brutality in this country, but imagine if the police were allowed to just occupy neighborhoods. And don't get me wrong, there are neighborhoods that they do go into and they do harass. But imagine if they were able to occupy neighborhoods at gunpoint every day. And they would threaten you and tell you, don't you even speak, I might start shooting. This is what Palestinians have been living under for decades. CNN finally has to acknowledge it.
CNN obtained this video from inside Hebron, a divided city, filmed a few days after the Hamas October 7 attack. The Palestinian man won't comply. He says he recognizes the man with the gun as a settler, not a soldier. In this tense climate, if a soldier issues an order, you comply. But is everyone with a gun and fatigues a soldier?
There's that question as well.
The West Bank is under Israeli military occupation. It's also believed to be home to almost 750,000 settlers, Israeli civilians living in the occupied territories. Settlers consider this part of their biblical homeland and are expanding into Palestinian territories, even though the UN Security Council considers their presence illegal.
And this goes back to what I said before about the UN. Okay, United Nations, it's great that you're saying this is illegal, but what are you going to do about it? So the United Nations is just good for making statements. They don't actually, there's no action implemented after they have made these statements. And this is very much terrifying. And I think we really have to, again, we can't just focus on Gaza. We also have to focus on what's happening in the West Bank as well. But again, you're seeing this on CNN.
Yet settlers are integral to Israel's security plan in the occupied territories, as Israel Defense Force reservists and settlement security squads. Responding, the IDF says, to security threats in settlements, towns, and villages. Palestinians told CNN they consider armed settlers a greater threat than ever before. Their remit from the IDF is blurring the lines as settlers encroach on Palestinian land.
So you have settlers who are now armed. First of all, the soldiers shouldn't be armed against the Palestinian people anyway. But now you have people who are they just live there. These are just people who are settlers who kicked Palestinians out of their homes. Now they have chosen to pick up arms and they're making the same demands as the IDF. This is insane. This would be like your neighbors deciding to arm themselves, not saying that they're not allowed to have a gun or whatever. But imagine your neighbors, say you live like in a little subdivision. Imagine your neighbors all like arming themselves and pointing their arms towards you. This is what people have to go through.
Like here, in the Palestinian village of Tuwani, where there's a settlement at the top of the hill. In this video, you see men in military fatigues. The IDF equips both civilian settler security squads and soldiers in the region. As you can see here, it's almost impossible to differentiate. They point their rifles at residents and then they shoot, according to eyewitnesses.
Settlers just pointing their weapons at residents and just shooting them. We're going to scoot up a little bit more here because I want you to hear what this guy says.
Military fatigues are forcing Palestinians off their land.
These settlers and with their guns, and they're pointing it to the head of the residents, and they tell them, if you don't leave in 24 hours, we will shot you. So the family would understand that they're not playing. It's a serious threat of killing if you don't leave your home. That led for like 35 families to leave. And these settlers have been wearing uniform also.
Settlers have heavyweight support in Israel's far-right government. Itamar Ben-Gvir, Minister for National Security, settler. After the Hamas October 7 attack, Ben-Gvir loosened gun permit regulations, making it easier for tens of thousands of Israeli civilians to bear arms. Bezalel Smotrich, Minister of Finance, settler, also post-attack pushed through over $100 million for West Bank security, including funds for training and equipping settler security squads. But it's not just arming and equipping. We witnessed firsthand some of the restrictions the IDF imposed on Palestinians. Ihtidal's house is not even 5 minutes away from the other side of this checkpoint, but she can't get through. Every day they tell her to go back, and every day she has to do this extraordinarily long loop to try and get in. She said they are intentionally making it difficult for us, making so we have to cross through areas that are hostile to us to get to our homes.
Yep.
Ihtidal picks up a few more things before she sets off home, but not too many. It's a long walk uphill. Since the 1990s, the city of Hebron has seen many curfews. The day we visited, there was a curfew in place from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Ihtidal has to go through this checkpoint. Palestinians have to be searched. Settlers aren't normally checked.
Could you imagine just going to the grocery store and then you're just trying to get home and you're stopped multiple times on your way and you're searched and you're checked? And again, this doesn't happen to everybody. They're just doing it to the Palestinian people.
Ihtidal has to walk. Settlers can drive. Palestinians need permission for visitors. Settlers don't.
How is this not apartheid? Listen to the laws of the land. She said the Israelis there can drive. She said Palestinians have to walk. They got to get approval for visitors. If your friend wants to come to your house, they have to get an approval just to come to your house. This is crazy.
The IDF says all these measures are in accordance with their security assessments to provide security for all residents. Settlers and Palestinians live side by side, but the rules for each are very different. Faiza and her husband have lived in this house for 14 years. They inherited it from her husband's grandparents. Their house is overlooked by an IDF sentry post, yet they fear for their safety.
This scene is so inappropriate and depressing for our home. You can see up here what we've had to put in place to protect ourselves from the settlers.
As we leave Faiza's house, we get stopped by an Israeli soldier. He says we're not allowed to walk along the main road. We have to go back to the checkpoint to be searched again.
You hear that? Multiple searches.
Because we've been inside a Palestinian home.
I would just point out a lack of logic, which is that these Palestinian houses, the Palestinians have come through that checkpoint, so they can't have possibly brought in anything.
Sorry, just so I can understand, just so I can understand, so I'm really confused, as usual.
So, even though we went through that checkpoint,
Yeah.
because we have been in the house of Palestinians, we now have to go jumping over people's garden walls.
So we can't walk on the street?
We can't go straight down.
Come back.
If you're going through the checkpoint and you stay here, it's great. But as soon as you move from different areas,
Yes.
so you need to get.
Now do you understand it?
Oh.
Yes. So we need to get.
This is what I was trying to tell people when I said they can't move freely. But many people will tell you, oh, no, there's no apartheid, right? Okay, so that's on CNN, guys. CNN is covering that. So it's gotten to the point now where even Piers Morgan, of all people, is having to finally admit that what Israel is doing is wrong. Nico shared this earlier. He said, sheesh, Ukraine lost NATO and Israel lost Piers Morgan in the same week. It's been a rough month for the puppets of the empire. Listen to Piers Morgan here.
London, welcome to Piers Morgan Uncensored. Throughout the long and deadly history of Israel's wars with Palestine, it's usually fallen to Israel's friends to tell them when it's time to stop. That time may be fast approaching again, even as Israel insists it needs more time to eradicate Hamas. It can only have itself to blame. This weekend, the IDF admitted to killing 3 of its own hostages in Gaza. The men were waving a white flag of surrender. They'd used scraps of food to scrawl SOS desperately pleading for help. Regardless of whether they were Israeli or Palestinian, there was no justification under international law for killing them. It's a clear breach of the rules of engagement.
Did you guys just hear that? So here's Piers Morgan, who has just been debating so many people the past couple of weeks about this particular issue. Norm Finkelstein, Rabbi Shmuley's been on there, Cenk Uger's been on there, and he's kind of notorious for that question, but do you condemn Hamas? Okay, so he's kind of notorious for that, but do you condemn Hamas? Even he is now saying that what the IDF did there is a violation of international law, regardless of who the hostages were.
What does that tragedy tell us about the way Israeli soldiers are treating Palestinian civilians? How seriously should we now take Israel's insistence it's doing everything it can to keep innocent people alive? In a separate incident, 2 innocent women were reportedly shot dead by sniper fire at a Catholic church in Gaza. One of them was leaving the church shelter to go to the toilet. Cardinal Vincent Nichols, the Archbishop of Westminster, one of Britain's most senior spiritual leaders, was scathing.
It's certainly a cold-blooded killing.
The Israeli Defense Force says didn't happen, wasn't there?
Well, I think that's hard to believe, frankly, because the people in Gaza and the Cardinal Archbishop of Jerusalem, they're not given to tell lies.
So you don't believe the Israeli Defense Force?
No, I don't.
Well, the Pope went even further. He said that what Israel's doing in Gaza now constitutes terrorism.
Unarmed civilians are being bombed and shot at, and this has even happened inside the Holy Family Parish complex, where there are no terrorists but families, children, and sick people with disabilities, nuns. Some say it's terrorism, it's war. Yes, it is war, it is terrorism.
The British government is shifting its position too. Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron, in a joint statement with his German counterpart, said he backs a sustainable ceasefire and said that too many civilians are being killed. Ben Wallace, the influential former Defence Secretary, said if Benjamin Netanyahu thinks a killing rage will rectify matters, then he's very wrong. His methods will not solve the problem. In fact, I believe his tactics will fuel the conflict for another 50 years. His actions are radicalising Muslim youth across the globe. I think he's right. All this after President Biden accused Israel of indiscriminate bombing, his starkest warning yet that America's backing is not unconditional. Well, news reports about the war in Gaza today will state that 18,000 Palestinians have been killed so far, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. And the key point about that often quoted sentence is not the debate about whether Hamas exaggerates those figures, is that Hamas is still in charge and able to release them as official numbers. After 2 months of war, endless atrocities and the full might of Israel's army unleashed on this tiny strip of land, the very people they're supposed to be eradicating are still firmly in power.
That part right there. The people that Israel is supposed to be eradicating are still in power. They have not rid Gaza of Hamas. They have not taken out Hamas. They have taken out thousands of civilians. I saw a total today that said 25,000. And I told you as time goes by, that number will continue to increase because, again, that's not the full body count. You have to wait until they pull all the bodies out from underneath the rubble. So the number is actually higher than what they're telling you that it is. And they're still continuing to bomb and kill civilians in Gaza. None of these actions that the IDF has done has taken out Hamas. And if they know that Hamas is in the tunnels, then why aren't they going into the tunnels? You see, make this make sense, people. Ro brought this up. And Ro, don't get me wrong, he's a fraud too. But Ro even brought this up. He said when the U.S. government went after bin Laden, they isolated the situation. They knew he was underground. They went underground. In this particular situation, if you know, and they have said this, if they know that Hamas is in the tunnel, why are you bombing the hospitals, the schools? And it's because of what Solomon said. Because they want to eradicate the entire culture and population. They are killing journalists because they do not want the news to continue to get out so people can see what's happening in Gaza. That's why. That's why. Piers is late on this. I wonder if Piers is going to issue an apology.
Only about 20% of Hamas terrorists so far, even if you accept IDF figures on this, have been killed. 80% remain alive and fighting. Well, most civilized countries and decent people back Israel's fundamental right to exist and indeed its duty to defend itself. But the war is now starting to look like more like retribution than strategy.
And at this point in time, how are they still defending themselves? If you and I get into a fight, and let's say I just happen to punch you in the face, and let's say I struck the first blow, and you knock me out, and I'm already down on the ground, but then you in turn go and you decide to fight everybody else around me who is not attacking you. How are you still defending yourself at that point if you already struck back the first time? And this is a question that people need to start asking. I'm sorry, we got to keep it real. People need to start asking this question. It's not a matter of whether or not you condemn Hamas, Piers Morgan, or if you support the state of Israel. The question that you should be asking anyone who comes to you with this: do you support the right for the Palestinian people to have self-determination and to be free? That's what this is really about. And if they say no, that tells you everything.
That suspicion is fueled by hardliners in Netanyahu's government and by Israeli commentators making appalling remarks like this. I support the war crimes. He laughs, as the other presenters laugh as well. Well, the rest of the world does not support war crimes. And if Israel...
Did you hear that? You see what he said? I'll read it to you. I mean, it's blatant. This is overt. It's overt. It's not even covert. They're not even trying to hide it. They are saying these things on interviews that they don't want them there.
That suspicion is fueled by hardliners in Netanyahu's government and by Israeli commentators making appalling remarks like this.
He says, I am for the war crimes. You see this? I don't care if I'm criticized. Again, it's blatant and out in the open.
I support the war crimes. He laughs, as the other presenters laugh as well. Well, the rest of the world does not support war crimes. And if Israel does have a plan and proof that it's working, it needs to start showing the evidence of that plan very soon.
So that's Piers Morgan starting to change his tune. JB says that is overt fascism and totalitarianism. Yeah. They want to mention that in reference to Donald Trump, but if it's Israel, we can't talk about it. And then there's Joy Reid. Even Joy Reid is starting to have criticism of Israel. Now, in this particular clip, she's calling out Nikki Haley. Now, I said before, obviously, if you're a Democrat, it's easier to call out a Republican. That's easy for you to do. Joy Reid needs to also call out the Democrat establishment politicians who are also backing Israel and are very vocal about it and are taking a lot of money from AIPAC like Hakeem Jeffries. But she's not going to go there because she still wants to keep her job at MSNBC. But listen to what she had to say here about Nikki Haley.
Okay, here was Nikki Haley, supposedly the Republicans' moderate alternative to Trump, talking about Israel and Gaza. Go.
When you look now and they talk about a two-state solution, every day that I was at the United Nations, it was never Israel opposing a two-state solution. It was always the Palestinians and Iran opposing a two-state solution. They never wanted that because they want to eliminate Israel altogether. So a two-state solution is not a true conversation because if you've ever talked to them, they don't want it. The Palestinians don't want a two-state solution.
I don't think that Nikki Haley has actually spoken to the Palestinian people. I'm just keeping it real. Okay. I don't think she has. She's like, if you talk to them. I don't think Nikki has talked to them.
What I think Israel should do and what I think America should do, we should support whatever Israel thinks will keep them safe.
Okay, let's get into it. Here's a little bit of the history of the Oslo Accords and a couple of clips about who's for it, meaning the peace process, and who's against it. Roll 'em.
Did you know this peaceful handshake between Israeli and Palestinian leadership was awarded with a Nobel Peace Prize? Yet 30 years later, peace seems like a distant dream.
Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask that you remain seated during the document signing.
The first of the Oslo Accords was signed on 13th September 1993.
Remember, guys, this happened under President Bill Clinton.
It should have marked the beginning of the end to the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank.
We have been granted the great privilege of witnessing this victory for peace. Just as the Jewish people this week celebrate the dawn of a new year, let us all go from this place to celebrate the dawn of a new era.
After a year of secret meetings in the Norwegian capital Oslo, after which the accords were named, a plan was established for Israel to withdraw from parts in the West Bank and Gaza. Plans were also made to transfer governing duties to a Palestinian interim government, which later resulted in the creation of the Palestinian Authority. Occupied Palestine was divided in three areas. A. Under full Palestinian control. B. Civil control, and Israel and Palestine would have joint security control. And C. Would be under control of Israel except over Palestinians. Both parties were given 5 years to follow up on the plan, and afterwards negotiations were set to reach permanent decisions on unresolved issues. A year after signing the Oslo Accords, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to former Palestinian Authority President Yasser Arafat, former Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, and former Prime Minister of Israel Yitzhak Rabin for their efforts to create peace in the Middle East. However, the Oslo peace process quickly entered a cycle of failed negotiations until it ultimately collapsed during the 2000 Camp David summit and the Second Intifada. Afterwards, attempts were made to restart negotiations towards a two-state solution, but they never resulted into conclusive agreements. 30 years later, Palestine is still illegally occupied by Israel, and Israeli settlers frequently construct new settlements in occupied Palestine under protection of the Israeli army. In 2019, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas said he would suspend all agreements with Israel after it demolished dozens of Palestinian homes on the outskirts of occupied East Jerusalem. Although Abbas made his threats before without implementing them, in 2020, he also said he would end security agreements with the United States and Israel. And 2022 was the deadliest year for the West Bank since the Second Intifada.
أننا نطالبكم اليوم رسميا ووفقا للقانون الدولي وقرارات الشرعية الدولية بإلزام إسرائيل باحترام قراراتكم هذه أو تعليق عضويتها في الأمم المتحدة.
Do you see that part? To make sure that Israel follows those resolutions, or Israel's membership in the UN would be suspended.
Middle East Eye's editor-in-chief David Hurst said,
"It is painfully clear that the prospect of creating a Palestinian state alongside one that defines itself as Jewish is zero. There are 700,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and not an Israeli politician or movement in sight who is prepared to remove them."
as he looked back on 30 years since the Oslo Accords.
On 4th of November 1995, the fifth Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated.
How convenient. You see, every time there's someone who wants to do peace, they just seem to get assassinated. MLK, Malcolm X. What was the other one I was going to mention? MLK, Malcolm X, or they're jailed. Nelson Mandela, JFK, and I'm pretty sure Nikki knows this, but she doesn't want to mention it.
Yitzhak supported the Oslo Peace Accords. He was assassinated by a supporter of Benjamin Netanyahu.
And we have to pause there because of YouTube You guys know how YouTube can be about this. So anyway, the person who wanted to move forward with peace was assassinated. And then we move forward to Benjamin Netanyahu.
And said so on worldwide television.
That's Netanyahu saying the first thing to do is to strike all of them and to strike hard. And this is him bragging about scuttling the Oslo Accords. The individual here says, hold on, but then again, the world will say that we're the aggressor. He says, the US, I know how they are. America is something that you can easily maneuver and move in the right direction. He brags about not being afraid to go against the Clinton administration and not being afraid to go against the United Nations.
מה היו הסכמי אוסלו? הסכמי אוסלו שהכנסת חתמה עליהם, שאלו אותי לפני הבחירות, נקיים, בתנאי כפוף להדדיות, צמצום הנסיבות. אבל איך מצמצם את הנסיבות? אני אתן פירוש להסכם שיאפשר לי להפסיק את הדהירה הזאת לקווי 67. איך עשינו את זה? אף אחד לא אמר מה זה אתרים צבאיים מוגדרים. אתרים צבאיים מוגדרים, אני אמרתי אלה אזורי ביטחון. בקעת הירדן, מבחינתי זה אתר צבאי מוגדר. נכון. זה אוקיי. אף אחד לא... לך תגיד. אבל אז הייתה שאלה, מי יגדיר מה זה אתרים צבאיים מוגדרים? קיבלתי מכתב מקריסטופר, אליי ולמפת, באותה לשון, שאומר שישראל בלבד היא זו שתגדיר מה הם.
See? He said that Israel will define the military facilities, their location and size, and he said Israel alone will do that.
את מיקום האתרים הצבאיים האלה ואת גודלם. עכשיו, הם לא רצו את המכתב הזה, אז לא נתתי את הסכם כמובן. הפסקתי את ישיבת הממשלה, אמרתי, אני לא חותר. רק כשהגיע המכתב, תוך כדי הישיבה, אליי ואל המפת, חתמתי על הסכם. תגיד לו שעדיף לתת 2% מאשר לתת 100%. וזו הברירה שעומדת כאן האתרים. ואתה נתת 2%, ובזה עצרת את הנסיגה הזאת.
Is there still a chance for a two-state solution?
I think it's about time for the world to realize the Oslo paradigm failed on the 7th of October, and we need to build a new one. And in order to build a new one...
Does that new one include the Palestinians living in a state of their own? Is that what it includes?
I think the biggest question is what type of Palestinians are on the other side. This is what Israel realized
do they
on
have
7th
a state,
of October.
though?
The answer is absolutely no, and I'll tell
See this? So when Nikki Haley, what Joy Reid was pointing out, when Nikki Haley made that statement and said the Palestinian people didn't want it, look at what's being revealed here. Netanyahu didn't want it. This woman here, Israeli ambassador, also did not want it.
Tell you why.
Well, then
because
how can there be peace? How can there be peace in
the reason there is no peace
Israel
is because the Palestinians...
without offering a state to Palestine, how can there be peace in Israel?
Israel knows today, and the world should know now, the reason the Oslo Accords failed is because the Palestinians never wanted to have a state next to Israel. They want to have a state from the river to the sea.
So the two-state solution is dead.
Okay, so you just saw that that was not true. Again, mountain of lies that we've seen told on national television. So even Chris Hayes is actually speaking out against it now. Yes, emoji guy himself. Listen to what Chris Hayes had to say here on All In with Chris Hayes.
But that aside, the deeper problem here is that if you spend any time at all
reading the Israeli press, listening to what Israeli leaders and commentators are actually saying, it is very clear that for a lot of people in government, the mass destruction of Gaza, raising it like Putin raised Grozny or Assad raised Aleppo, is the point, the goal. Many prominent members of the Israeli governing class don't think there is such a thing as an innocent civilian in Gaza, have said that everyone in Gaza deserves their fate.
None of them were saying this immediately after October 7th. None of them were saying this. Now, it's true. It's true. They now have the go-ahead to do so. In fact, that makes me want to address this question from Obama Loves Larry Sinclair. Thank you for the super chat. Why is the mainstream doing true journalism all of a sudden? That is a good question. Maybe because they realize that independent media has now become such a threat. Also, their ratings, at least at CNN, their ratings are terrible. But I think, again, because a lot of the video footage that has been coming out of Gaza has been from Al Jazeera or independent media.
From Knesset member Meirav Ben-Ari saying that, quote, the children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves, to an Israeli military spokesman saying the emphasis of Israel's military campaign was, quote, on damage and not on accuracy, to Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, suggesting there are no civilians in Gaza and everyone is a legitimate target, to journalist Shimon Riklin, who said this on Israeli TV.
חס וחלילה, פשע מלחמה זה אני, אתה רגל על הגב. פשע מלחמה זה אני מודה, אני אגיד את זה פה, לא אכפת לי שירדו עליי, אוספים פה חומרים. אני לא נרדם טוב בלי שאני רואה בתים קורסים בעזה. מה אני אעשה? עוד בתים, עוד מגדלים, שלא יהיה להם לאן לחזור.
He sat there and said he wanted to see more of them destroyed. And the statement that was made before that one, where he held a newspaper article where the guy said there are no civilians in Gaza, that statement was made October 16th. And a lot of these major outlets were still silent, still not willing to criticize Israel.
Not a fringe view in Israel. I mean, even the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, invoked the lessons from the biblical story of Amalek and addressed the nation in Hebrew in the end of October. And in that biblical chapter, God commands King Saul on how to respond to an attack by the rival kingdom of Amalek. Quote, now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put them to death, men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Now, I will be the first to confess I have no idea what to do about Hamas or about what comes next. But the Amalek method cannot be the solution. To be honest, I'm not particularly convinced the Israeli leadership has any idea what comes next. Many want full destruction. And Hamas also wants this war. They have been clear on that. I think they want it to continue. They seem to think all of this death and destruction benefits in the end because of the rage it will produce towards Israel. But whatever your views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is just plainly the case that our country is supporting a war whose animating moral logic looks to most of the world, and frankly to me, to be that every single last person in Gaza is guilty and deserves their lot. And that is the moral logic of Hamas. It is the moral logic that drove the atrocity of October 7th. And an atrocity like October 7th cannot justify whatever comes after it, whatever the response. There is no terrorist attack, no matter how horrific, and truly October 7th was horrific, that can wash clean what we are seeing in Gaza and what we as Americans and our government are abetting.
Can you believe you heard that from MSNBC? You see what I mean? It took 25,000 people being killed for him to make that statement. But the reality is this did not start on October 7th. As you heard earlier, again, we've talked about this before multiple times on the show. They have been terrorizing, oppressing, kicking people out of their homes, putting Palestinians on a caloric diet. 90% of the water is dirty, preventing Palestinians from even fishing on their own coast, controlling all the resources, beating Palestinians in the middle of the street, humiliating them in front of people, This has been going on for decades. And it took the state of Israel killing 25,000 of them in this short time frame for the mainstream media pundits to finally speak up. You don't get there without investigative journalists that were actually in Gaza, Al Jazeera, independent media, and the massive protests all across the globe. You don't get there without that. And I continue to say till this day, vote for whoever you want, but the power comes from the people on the outside, the people in the streets. That's how these movements have been won. The civil rights movement was not won in DC. It was won in the streets. The women's rights movement was won in the streets. Now, yes, there was political legislation that came after that, but it was because of the movement outside in the street that pushed the politicians to do the right thing. Go to some of the comments here, but things are changing. Thank you for the super chat, Quintessential. In uni where you worked at, what % of the students were true leftists? What were the rest of them like? Did anything about their politics shock you? So you have to understand, like, I was an academic advisor here in Boston, Massachusetts. So I'm already living in a place that for the most part can be pretty progressive. Just keep that in mind. But I would say most of the students were pretty progressive. And I worked with like the Gen Z group. So most of them were pretty progressive if they were into politics, but there were also students that were conservative as well. And then some students just weren't interested in politics at all. But most of them here were more so progressive. David said the future Sabby described is honestly like the Purge films, but in real life. David said, but do you condemn Hamas, Piers? I know. He killed me with that. Thank you for the super chat, P. Smith. The Christians in Bethlehem canceled Christmas. And Auntie Shawnee TV, I'm glad you're showing the video I wrote you about that came out years ago. Thank you, Sabrina. You are welcome, Auntie Shawnee.